Good afternoon from Singapore. Good morning to those of you joining us from Europe, and good evening to those who might be joining from elsewhere in the world. I'm Chris Humphrey, Executive Director at the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars looking at finance issues across the ASEAN region. Today we are looking at sustainability reporting and the need for transparency for investors and economic recovery for Southeast Asia. The importance of sustainability reporting is growing. There is increasing demand by investors to evaluate the environmental, social and governance metrics of companies when making investment choices and decisions. While there is investor demand for greater transparency, though, the release of ESG information, sustainability reporting, etc., remains on a voluntary basis across much of the region. The financial climate, though, is changing, and industries worldwide are gradually disclosing their sustainability reports to complement their normal financial reporting. This is to increase investor confidence in the companies, and here in ASEAN, that is no different. Within the region, sustainability reporting is gaining traction and growing in significance. Yet, only 6 ASEAN countries have adopted ESG principles, of which only 1 has managed to meet the global average level. In this webinar, we hope to share how companies and businesses in the region are beginning to embrace ESG reporting to bring transparency to investors. And our panelists, I hope, will share their insights on how adoption on sustainability reporting will enhance the competitiveness of ASEAN as a region. In doing so, we'll be addressing some key questions such as, how does sustainability reporting make businesses more attractive for investors? How can we encourage widespread adoption of such practices? What are the hurdles in doing so? And what are the resources needed for adoption of sustainability reporting region-wide? I have a very senior and esteemed panel with us here today. We have Amanda Murphy. She is the Head of Commercial Banking for South and Southeast Asia, HSBC. Amanda's based here in Singapore, where we are, and she co-leads on HSBC's Asia Pacific Commercial Banking franchise, with oversight of 13 high-growth markets, including many in key ASEAN countries. She's also a member of HSBC's Global Commercial Banking Executive Committee and has over 2 decades of banking experience right across the globe. Also with us today is Andrew Naylor. He's the Regional CEO for Asia Pacific, excluding China, at the World Gold Council. And previously to that role at WGC, he was leading on a number of public policy initiatives globally, including the work they were doing on Islamic finance. Also with us today is Lim Bayan. She is the head of the Sustainability Office at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. She leads on green finance and asset management issues and financial market development. We also then have Miranda Carr. Miranda is the Executive Director for ESG Research at MSCI, covering the Asia Pacific region, where she looks at the major trends for ESG reporting and thematics in that area, as well as working on investment frameworks linked to ESG. And last but not least, we have Pornvidi Pirkun. Pornvidi is the Public Affairs and Sustainable Development and Mobility Manager at Michelin, where she's been working for some time now. And she has a variety of experience across many industries, including in advertising, banking, NGOs, and manufacturing. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll kick off the discussion, if we don't mind, with Lim Bayan, as the representative for government in the region. And I think it's probably fair to say, Bayan, that Singapore's been a bit of a leader on green financing issues across Southeast Asia. Perhaps you can just give us a bit more of an insight as to what Singapore's been doing since it launched its Green Finance Action Plan in 2019 and where the next steps might take us.
Sure, I think there are 2 levels to your question, the Singapore ambition and what MAS is doing. But maybe, starting off to say that I think in 2021 and 2022 was really a pretty pivot year for most countries and businesses, recognizing that going green and becoming more sustainable is no longer a choice or your option, right? It is a must do. And it's not just the governments that have to reduce the emissions trajectory, but at the same time, I think many businesses are also facing a lot of pressure from stakeholders, the activists, your end users, which is the consumers, as well as the investors. And to that end, Singapore, we actually launched the Green Action Plan, Singapore Green Plan 2030, last year, which has 5 pillars around city and nature, which is to make Singapore's neighborhoods greener and also having more carbon sinks. We have this energy reset pillar, which is to use more cleaner energy, sustainable living, resilient future around making sure that agriculture and whatnot has a good food security, and also the green economy. And probably many of you would have also noticed that in the budget discussions that just took place around 1 to 2 months ago, there was a ratcheted up rhetoric in terms of that from a net zero perspective, where our government has also committed to reaching net zero no later than the middle century, as well as a hike in carbon taxes to be aligned with more of the global developments that's happening internationally. So from that angle, I would say that it's really a big push, and what we're trying to do now, not just within MES but across the various government agencies, is to work very closely with different sectors to implement and make sure that even as we move towards net zero, it happens in an orderly and more important, a just manner, right? So using, say, maritime as an example, that's where the MPA authority, which is the Maritime and Port Authority, they are working closely, to see how the bunkering operations can be more sustainable in the medium and longer term. For example, converting to more sustainable energy such as biofuels, bio-LNG, methanol for hydrogen carriers. And last year, they also set up this R&D center to see how they could explore technology and the use of green fuels in maritime. Likewise, within MES, because our mandate is around financial sector, but then finance makes the world goes round, right? You need finance to also support some of this climate adaptation, climate mitigation projects as well. We likewise launched our Green Finance Action Plan, I think as alluded earlier, but that has evolved quite significantly in a span of 2 years. And right now, I think our focus is around 3 key things: building resilience, which is our environmental risk management guidelines, strengthening and making sure that the financial sector understands what the risks are from a stress testing perspective. A lot of work is around data and disclosures, which we could talk about maybe later as well, focusing, really to make sure that good data is being disclosed, because in the absence of those data, it's difficult for the financial sector to make informed business decisions as well. And lastly is around leveraging fintech to support and be an enabler for green finance.
Thanks so much for that overview. Amanda, I'll come to you next. I mean, HSBC as a bank is increasingly doing more and more work on sustainable financing. Just how much do you think that greener and sustainable investments will be as a key driver for future growth in the banking industry?
Thanks, Chris. We think this is so important. Climate change, global warming, they pose such an existential threat to mankind that transition is not a choice anymore, that those days have long passed. Pressure from governments, pressure from the regulators, pressure from investors, from customers, and pressure from our own staff is just increasing. So our ambition at HSBC is to provide somewhere between $750 billion and $1 trillion worth of finance investment by 2030 to help our customers battle climate change. Last year, we were very proud to be the biggest underwriter of green, social, sustainable and sustainability-linked bonds here in Asia. We nearly doubled the previous year's volumes, which shows really the appetite in the marketplace as corporates do more in this space. We issued over $207 billion worth of GSSS bonds, and 51 billion of those were here in Asia. So really starting to get some good traction. I think, Chris, at the heart of the transition is that concept of internalizing externalities. So the consequences of our activities that affect a third party. And historically, traditional models have used market prices as relevant signals for decision making. But these these don't incorporate social, environmental impact of our activities. And I think it's really important that we all understand that shift that is happening. For international financial institutions like HSBC, data is such a key enabler to fulfilling our commitments and to supporting the transition here in ASEAN and beyond. And that's really at the heart of our sustainability strategy. To reduce emissions in our own portfolio, we need to have a very clear understanding of our customers' emissions. And we are relying, therefore, very strongly on data modeling for our assessments. But using the availability of good quality data helps provide enhanced signals for how we make decisions going forward. I think it's of paramount importance to us to support that transition here in ASEAN. And so we believe that nobody can do it alone, no one company, no one woman, no one man, that we are working very closely with peers in the financial services industry, with governments, with regulators, and with our customers, so that we can scale up climate finance in Asia. And industry surveys highlight the variances in disclosure frameworks as one of the key barriers to overcome when we're incorporating sustainability in their operations. And in our climate policies, we rely on the best available science. And when we work with our customers on their aspirations for transition and their challenges, we want to enable them to rely on the best available data too. So a long way of saying extremely important, Chris, for us.
I think extremely important for all of us, actually, and for the whole planet. Miranda, we heard there about Amanda saying about how important data was. It's a key enabler. Graham mentioned it as well, that data was key. You're working in a organization which does a lot of work on ESG metrics. Just how important is sustainability reporting and getting those metrics right?
Oh, it's a crucial factor, because if you don't have the right reporting and if you don't have the data, you're operating in basically a potential just a black hole of information. And that's not only sort of not helpful in order to be able to assess whether it's the climate or the environmental or some of the other ESG issues, but it also means that there's a much greater likelihood of greenwashing, and the potential for lots of sort of, very nice sounding sort of marketing messages to come out, and lots of sort of, good proposals to come out. But it's not really until you get the data and when you can see what the companies are doing, what the requirements are in terms of some of these sort of key ESG and climate issues, that you really get a sense of how much needs to be done and where all the different companies are positioned. But the great thing is that we are seeing a significant increase in disclosure and reporting throughout the ASEAN region. Now, markets like Singapore, where, as Bayan was saying, the awareness has been very strong, the reporting has been very strong, and also the practices which the companies are now following are up to a sort of a high standard. I mean, that's where you get to the data availability is relatively good. I mean, nothing's ever perfect, but you're also seeing that reflected in sort of the company's performance and the way how that we assess the companies in terms of their ratings or their climate risks. But you're now getting, all as well as sort of the example set by Singapore, you also have, I mean, Thailand is now this year rolling out significant new ESG disclosures on the stock exchange. You have the ASEAN taxonomy aligned with the Singapore taxonomy. And then even in other markets like Malaysia, you have disclosure requirements significantly increasing for the companies, and particularly obviously around the climate issue, as well as some of the broader ESG metrics. And that means that you get a much better assessment of where the companies are, how much they're improving, and that gives both the companies themselves, but also the investors and lenders like HSBC, much better insights into both where the risks are, but also, I mean, a massive factor in the ASEAN region is the opportunities. because it's investing in things like some of the solutions, like the renewable energies or the access to finance, access to healthcare. So it's not just all about assessing risks, it's actually looking about the opportunities in the region. And that's one of the sort of most exciting things, but you definitely need the data in order to be able to assess which ones are real and which ones are more sort of, shall we say, greenwashing.
Thank you. Bonvedi, Randy there was just talking about the importance of ESG reporting. I mean, Michelin as an organisation has been doing reports on its environmental, society and governance performance now for some time, in fact, almost 2 decades. How important is it for Michelin to be doing this reporting, both for its own potential future investors and also perhaps even for your clients and customers?
Right, thank you, Chris. Michelin has a long experience in reporting on sustainability. Already, we started in 2002. We published the first, what we call Michelin Performance and Responsibility Charter, highlighting the principle for the group and the sustainable growth, maintaining a balance between economic performance, respect for the environment, and the continuous respect for our employee and civil society. This charter was the cornerstone of the regular reports on sustainability. In 2013, we already committed on profit, people, and planet ambition for 2020. Because Michelin is a French partnership limited by shares listed on the Euronext Paris Stock Exchange. As such, in very host country around the world, it applies the CSR reporting standards defined by the French legislation, resulting in the transcription of the non-financial reporting directive of the European Union. To strike the right balance between regulatory compliance, meeting stakeholder, and including investor expectations, we take into account the UN SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. We have reinforced the stakeholder dialogue because stakeholder dialogues improve our understanding of stakeholder expectations and how they are changing, thereby providing us more reliable basis for decision making. At the corporate executive level, a stakeholder committee has been put in place since 2016. It brings together 12 people, representative of the group leading stakeholders, including suppliers, investors, union, customers, and NGO. 4 continents are represented in the committees. We meet for a full day, at least once a year, to discuss the group sustainability development strategy. In addition to define and manage its main responsibility issue, the group has prepared what we call a materiality matrix, which serves as a frame of reference in identifying the main risks that structure this non-financial performance statement. The issue identifying the matrix represent not only potential risks, but also opportunity for growth and business development. For this reason, we can anticipate potential risks and an opportunity for our business, contributing to our competitiveness and attractiveness to investors. And at the group level, many investors ask for specific presentations about non-financial performance. Our financial communication department present regularly to investors the situation on Michelin concerning non-financial performance. So Michelin is rated per the main ESG agencies and is part of the main SRI index or social responsible investing index. Being rated and present in recognized index bring continuous benchmark and assessment for us. So company that acts on environmental, social, and governance issues are more likely to attract investor. While ESG is not yet a make or break issue in ASEAN, company needs to integrate these ESG factors into their corporate strategy if they want to draw major foreign investors. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Andrew, I'll come to you. I mean, you work for the World Gold Council. Gold actually is not just a precious metal and something that is used as a financial tool. It's also something vital to much of the global supply chain, particularly in electronics and smartphones, etc. Yet mining is not an industry we would normally associate with environmental good. But at WGC, you have launched your responsible gold mining principles back in 2019. Can you give us just some oversight as to what that means throughout the gold supply chain and how it's progressing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, sustainability issues in ESG is nothing new for the extractives industry. I mean, it's true that in the last couple of years, things have, I guess, come to the fore, particularly around the climate change debate and climate change or climate disclosures. But for the extractives industry more broadly and the gold mining industry specifically, there's always been ESG externalities that have had to be addressed and dealt with. And the previous speakers have all focused on data and standardized disclosures, and that's really how it's evolved from the World Gold Council's perspective and in terms of the work that we're doing. So taking a step back, we used to be looking at specific issues, perhaps in isolation, not just the World Gold Council, but other industry bodies in the gold mining space. So we pioneered the conflict-free gold standard about 10 years ago, which was to eliminate conflict of gold from the supply chain, and the diamond industry has done something similar. But there are other issues as well. For example, the use of cyanide in gold production, and there are very, very stringent rules around that through the International Cyanide Management Code. And then you have things like the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible sourcing and so on. So there's been lots of, I'd say, thematic approaches to ESG. What we needed, though, was something that brought it all together into a single framework. And the driver for that really was the need for data and the need for harmonized and standardized disclosures. So that's why we launched the Responsible Gold Mining Principles a few years ago. All of our members have signed up to those. It's not just for our members, but it's for others as well. But they account for around about 65–70% of annual production of gold, large-scale production of gold. But the RGMPs, they were designed to bring all of the other different rules that apply to our industry into a single framework, and that just makes it easier for investors, for ratings agencies, for pressure groups to, I guess, undertake an audit and undertake due diligence. So, you know, whilst there's definitely been in the last couple of years a refocusing on certainly on the climate change aspect of ESG, it's really nothing new for our industry. There are obviously quite specific challenges that the extractives industry face. I mean, you mentioned gold's use in the supply chain. It's a hugely important asset, not just in terms of financial stability, but has utility as a technical good or a good in electronics, for example. So it has utility. It's an essential industry. It's not, it's not a luxury good. Some people think of gold as being a luxury good, a bit frivolous. It's not. It's hugely important in different markets for different reasons. But the focus now, though, is moving away from reporting and the RGMPs, which is hugely important. We've seen a lot of good traction there, but we're now broadening it out. So we're looking at not just the production of gold and the ESG externalities there, but how gold is used throughout the supply chain. And investors are increasingly, and consumers of goods are increasingly rightly concerned about provenance, about how material has moved through the supply chain, who's used it, has it been used for illicit trade or not, all these kind of things. So earlier this week, we partnered with another organisation which, and the two of us really cover the global gold industry, but the London Bullion Market Association, who set standards for gold bars that are used by central banks and commercial financial institutions. We are working together on a system of traceability throughout the supply chain. So I think I'll stop there on this question. We've seen a lot of traction on the RGMPs, which is about harmonized disclosure. But there's a new focus now, which is much more broader than simply reporting your ESG externalities. It's about full traceability and full visibility over the supply chain. And there are two reasons why it's coming about now. One is this renewed focus and investor pressure and consumer pressure and activist pressure, but also the technology has evolved. Blockchain and sort of similar distributed ledger technologies. These really have basically allowed us to, or given us the technological capability to have a much more granular focus on material as it moves through the supply chain. So it's a common pressure, but also technological development that really means that the focus is changing now, and that we can actually operationalize broader ESG solutions.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm quite right to mention the S and the G as well. It's not just the environment part, although that's often where we tend to focus our attention. People in the audience, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll get round to them and pick them up as we're going through. Amanda, perhaps if I can just turn back to you. I mean, we've been talking here a lot about data is key, about how ESG reporting is important. How do you, as a financial institution, encourage your customers to do more ESG reporting? And what would you like to see more from governments in this area?
I think a couple of things here. There are challenges for the big financial institutions. One of the challenges is market fragmentation. And when markets are fragmented, we know the cost of compliance in companies increases, and we know that decision making slows down. So I think basing standards from the widely adopted international standards are very important to make sure we have a consistency across markets, and that companies who are trying to do their very best here, that we're making it easier for them. I think in ESG reporting, this is particularly challenging because quite a few international standards for ESG disclosures currently exist. We talk about WEF, SASB, GRI, etc. And these are in addition to the various listing rules and requirements that we see. So I think we very much welcome the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a global body under IFRS. And the aim there is to deliver a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability related disclosure standards that provide investors, but also provide capital market participants with the information they need about companies' sustainability related risks and the opportunities to help them make better decisions. And where Miranda's already raised the concern around greenwashing, that's something we're extremely alive to. So as we think that as initiatives that drive adoption across our region, we've seen some really encouraging and actually we're leading examples. And I think our view would be these initiatives are most effective when they're holistic. They're most effective when they're driven together by both policymakers and industry players. We've seen capacity building programs, investing in data platforms and assurance costs. And I'll give you an example of that. The Alliance for Green Commercial Banks is a really interesting alliance with IFC and HKMA. We're a cornerstone member there. And the goal of this initiative is for industry leaders in sustainability to mentor, to upskill, to coach smaller local financial institutions across Asia. And disclosure and reporting is one of the key themes that the Alliance is working on. And likewise in Singapore, again, Project Greenprint, looking at developing a data platform so we can aggregate the existing ESG data that's there and think about how we share that across more corporates and more financial institutions. One of the challenges that I hear from companies, one of the challenges is encouraging SMEs to provide these disclosures without creating a huge burden and additional cost for them. And that's, I'm sure you'll hear that when you're talking to some of the SMEs in the region. Our charity, the Hong Kong Bank Foundation, supports a project by the University of Hong Kong, which is exploring how best to engage SMEs in ESG reporting, because we need all of the supply chain to be able to do this. And then probably the last thing I'd say is that we've got to take an important and a leading role in how we supply reliable data, how we do environmental disclosure. In Malaysia, HSBC Amana was the first bank to publish TCFD compliant financial disclosures, which were aligned with the recommendations in the report, I think, from April last year. So lots happening, lots of challenges in terms of cost and burden, but that's how we can synchronize as much as possible, the various rules and requirements will be really key to our success.
Thank you. Amanda mentioned there the importance of policymakers being involved in development of initiatives. What are sort of measures is MAS taking to encourage greater role from the financial sector on ESG issues, and in particular, perhaps on helping industries achieve net carbon zero?
You may know, or maybe some of you may know, that we're embarking on this pilot program in conjunction and together with the SGX. And that's this thing called the Common ESG Disclosure Platform. And basically what it does is to connect the what we call upstream users, which is basically your corporates, and then your downstream users, which can be regulators like ourselves, the financial institutions, rating agencies, through a technology-powered enabled platform. And the intention is that because there are certain requirements that the SGX has also set in terms of TCFD compliance. They have a set of 27 metrics, and when they were surveying some of the listed companies last year, there was an overwhelming response and agreement, like over 90%, that having this kind of disclosure platform that allows true train reporting is extremely resourceful and useful for them. So what this disclosure platform intends to do is that starting off with the list codes as a pilot, but eventually to expand it to also the non-listed companies, which are very important because there's such a large segment of not just Singapore, but the ASEAN community as well. And it's from a consent-based kind of sharing, where different reporting data, either that the company can provide or substantiating with invoices, etc., can be uploaded and then transformed into multiple reporting templates that can be used by the downstream users. So hopefully by the end of the year, that's what we're aspiring towards, this platform will go live, and then from there, we can slowly expand it to more users as well. At the same time, wearing the regulatory hat, because MAS, we have so many different functions brought into one organization. We have been a strong supporter of what the IFRIS Foundation has been doing through the IOSCO, because MAS, we were co-leading the IOSCO Sustainable Finance Task Force. That was kind of shaping and also providing inputs into how the ISSB prototype could look like, even prior to the setting up of the ISSB. And going forward is also how then do we align and also encourage not just our listed companies, but also the financial institutions to be aligned to TCFD and to some of these global reporting standards like ISSB. At a more international and regional forum, because there are many different committees that MAS is part of, together with, say, the ASEAN securities regulators. And one of them is this committee called the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum. Actually, last year in October 2021, there was also kind of like a global pledge among the ASEAN community that, within ASEAN, there should be a move towards TCFD, and then eventually also move towards ISSB. And it's quite heartening to see that, I think it was yesterday or the day before, if I remember correctly, that even the stock exchange in Malaysia has also announced, some intention to have TCFD reporting, although not finalized yet, but at least it's a good signal and a start in terms of that journey.
Thanks. Miranda, from your point of view, how important is it that we move more and more towards perhaps having mandatory reporting imposed through stock exchanges or through other bodies, and how also it's important to have a standardized approach to ESG reporting?
Well, if I take the first question, standardized approaches are extremely important, both to get, so you can assess sort of the company against its peer group, but also obviously, as Amanda was saying, on the international comparisons. Because an interesting point that, that Andrew raised was about sort of how a lot of people had already been sort of looking at a lot of the ESG issues. And yes, I mean, anyone who has been analyzing mining companies or sort of any of the materials companies knows that there's these big community risks, there's big labor risks, there's big environmental risks. And any analyst worth their salt has been looking at these risks in terms of sort of looking at how the companies and sectors evolve for many years. But what the ESG, concentrating on it as ESG, standardizing the reporting and making sure that every company follows the same rules, is that you can actually get instead of it being a much more qualitative assessment where you think, oh yeah, I think that company is quite nice to its community stakeholders, or I think that company is sort of quite good in terms of managing sort of its land use, and a lot of it is based on an analyst assessment or company assessment or the management assessment. The importance of having the standardized data and also then the standards that which people can follow is you get a much clearer idea of, are they following particular policies? Do they actually have policies at a boardroom level in terms of how they manage, labor rights issues? Do they have any, you can tell if they've had any legal cases against them, because that should be then reported. If there's been any strikes or lockouts, or if there's been any controversies. So the fact that you can basically then capture these consistently across individual companies means that you can both assess the sector risks, but you can also take a much more systematic approach to assessing how the company is handling that. And it gives you a much better reflection. And again, I mean, the comparison's been made quite a lot, but it's very similar to the development of the financial accounting standards. Whereas previously, back in the 1920s, companies might give you a vague idea of whether it was doing okay and whether it was still an ongoing concern. But it's not until you could get the standardized and comparable data that you could actually assess whether that company was taking that seriously. And in terms of the mandatory versus voluntary argument, I mean, I think for the core metrics, it's going to have to be imposed on a mandatory basis, and we've seen the difference that makes with things like the TCFD. So although in different markets you can have companies may have to do it for reputational reasons, as soon as you make it mandatory, then, or sort of compliant or explain, then the level of compliance, and it means you then start capturing the companies that may not be quite so aligned with promoting their environmental and social and governance journey. So the mandatory nature, compliant exchange for I think at the very least for those metrics which are material to that sector or material to companies, whether it's on the governance level, is really an essential starting point. And I think once we get as Amanda was flagging, the international sustainability accounting standards, and everyone reporting to that, it will just become sort of second nature, even if companies may not. And then in terms of the voluntary disclosures, yes, they're very helpful. That gives you a better sense of how well the company's managing. I mean, our assessments, our ESG ratings and our ESG scoring is not based on disclosure per se, but obviously if a company is addressing these issues, is aware of what it's doing and is reporting them, then there's a much greater awareness at a company level and also an investor level, and that gives you an indication of how seriously the company is taking those issues and whether it's incorporating it in its day-to-day management. So a mixture of mandatory and voluntary gives you a fairly good assessment. But I think a bare minimum of mandatory reporting is required.
Will ever get to a position, Miranda, where in the same way that companies have to do their financial reporting on a regular basis, they're going to be doing the ESG one at the same time alongside it, just as a matter of course?
I think absolutely, yes. I mean, that's I mean, if that's not happening in the next 5-10 years, then we're definitely doing something wrong. Because if you a lot of these issues, they're not they're not nice to haves. They're not the company would like to treat its take its workforce out for an away day every year or something like that. These are not sort of nice things to have. These are genuinely financially material risks. And as I was saying, these are all, a lot of these metrics are things which analysts would have always taken into account if it was material to the business. I mean, if you spoke to a pharma analyst, they would never say, oh yeah, no, we don't bother with a company's health and safety record. No, we never look at that. We only look at the financials. I mean, that would be insane to say that. And similarly for mining, you would be looking at what it's doing with its waste and what it's doing with community relations. So a lot of these metrics are all things that people would take into account anyway, but the fact they're standardized because they are financially material to the company's businesses and to the risks means investors need to know about them. And it's just the standardization. I mean, it's a bit messy at the moment, obviously, because we're now, we've gone on a very, very fast journey from people not paying attention to suddenly everyone paying attention. And now we're in this kind of like, bashing out all the standards and trying to make sure what's appropriate and what's feasible. And it's going to take a few years to sort of sort it out. So it's a little bit messy at the moment, but I think in the next sort of 5-10 years, it's going to become increasingly normal and standard to look at these things, and it won't seem like a novelty.
Yes, so I mean, Pawnvidi and Andrew, perhaps I'll address this question to you both. But how important is it that you bring ESG reporting into your respective industries and sectors, and do you see it perhaps as a competitive advantage to be early movers on this compared to your peers? Pawnvidi?
Sure. Since we are discussing about the standard of the report, may I share our view on this as well, Chris? So sustainability consideration have been growing for years and have led to a significant increase in reporting disclosure, and especially for large company. For example, the Universal Reference Document published annually by Michelin Group, sustainability section has been multiplied by 4 in 10 years. We produced 26 pages in 2010, and it became 104 pages in 2020. Whereas the financial section has increased by less than 10% on the same period. So this increase in reporting disclosure asks for quality of information in terms of consistency, comparability on year-over-year. Unique set of standards are available for financial disclosure, but this is not yet the case for sustainability considerations. To ensure quality in reporting for sustainability reporting, Michelin rely on accepted principle and standard developed per different organizations such as TCFD and SBTi to validate target defined by the group for greenhouse gas emission, for example. However, there is still a diverse situation in terms of sustainability disclosure and standards. Michelin welcome initiative led by ISSB or EFRAG to adopt international standard for sustainability. Having an international common framework for sustainability is the key, especially for international company working with European, Asian, and American investors. The ongoing review of non-financial reporting directive with CSR directive can foster the alignment within and out of Europe. Two conditions will help having an efficient implementable CSRD. One is finding the right level of details, and two is establishing an appropriate hierarchy of topics to be disclosed, Chris. That's what we'd like to share.
Thank you. And Andrew, for the gold sector, I mean, you have members throughout the gold supply chain. Do they see that the need for ESG reporting is going more and more paramount and giving them an advantage in the market?
Well, the need for disclosure and reporting is, hugely important in terms of giving them an advantage. No, because we represent the large scale mines. Our framework is open to anybody. It draws on. It's not attempting to reinvent the wheel or create new standards. All it's doing is taking all of the existing standards, some of which have been around for a while, some of which are newer, and putting it into a single framework. And that makes it easier to report. It makes it easier to interrogate. But data disclosure is one part of the equation. You need to look at assurance as well, and the role of auditors and having some kind of independent assurance framework built into it. And I think that's essential to one of the ways, not the only way, and certainly not a guarantee, but it would help alleviate some of the issues around greenwashing, for example. But I think the debate needs to evolve, and there needs to be a greater focus on not just standardizing reporting and disclosure requirements, having a single taxonomy, all that kind of stuff, but a sort of a more holistic ecosystem that is robust and where the data can be trusted, and there's some greater emphasis on some kind of independent assurance framework. And it's hugely important as well because people care. People have always cared, but I think COVID has led to certainly an increased focus on ESG. A lot of the debate, and this is the point I was making before, a lot of the debate at the moment is about climate change, and that's hugely important. I mean, it's a massively important issue, but we can't forget the other elements of ESG, and for the extractives industry, they can be quite pronounced. Environmental concerns are top of mind, but in terms of interaction with host communities and corporate governance arrangements and licensing regimes and how that's managed, and workers' rights and labor standards, that's all part of it. Sometimes the debate, though, understandably is focusing on climate change, but then there does need to be a recognition that ESG is much broader than that, and it's through third-party requirements on disclosure and data reporting and independent assurance that you can guarantee to some extent that those other important issues around ESG are taken into consideration as well. But COVID as well has certainly refocused minds. I think there's a recognition that sustainable businesses, or those that have a good ESG performance, they often lead to better long-term financial performance. A business that really does care about ESG considerations is often a better run or a better managed business. And there's also investment pressure as well. Miranda doesn't mind, it was an MSCI survey last year of institutional investors, and it was representing about, it was close to it's about $20 trillion of assets under management, but almost 3/4 of those surveyed said that they were planning to increase their ESG exposures and or increase the ESG lens that they apply to investing. And there's been other studies as well. I've seen one by JP Morgan and RBC over the last 12 months as well that have pointed to a similar direction of travel. So in short, yeah, disclosure is hugely important, but it's not the only thing. You need a more holistic framework that includes independent assurance, that includes these checks and balances, if you like, that include the regulators, include investor pressure, trade bodies, voluntary, mandatory disclosures, all coming together to create that, I guess, that tension, that separation of power that we talk about in constitutional discussions needs to be applied to to corporate discussions as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes or so left for this panel. There's one question in the Q&A which I want to pose to each of my panelists in turn, and I'll perhaps ask Bayan to answer it first because I know she has to run off to another meeting. The question comes from Kevin Edmonds, and he's saying, what are, let's say, 3 measures that the panelists would like to see implemented that could accelerate the wider adoption of ESG disclosure in the ASEAN region, in particular for SMEs and in supply chains? But Bayan, I'm going to throw this one to you first.
Yeah, I would say fundamentally, even before we talk about, what are the metrics, etc., to disclose, is really more concerted effort around capacity building and understanding the whole process, because in the space of listed, probably a lot of them are advanced, they know what they're doing. But when we go to SMEs and unlisted, it's not there yet. The other would be really around technology, such that eventually over time, the dream thing is that you don't even need to report technology using AI or satellite imagery or whatnot is able to pull out those data needs and transform it in a usable manner for the end user.
Okay, thank you. Amanda, your hand's up, so I'm going to you next.
I think that was a fluke, but nevertheless, happy for you to come to me. I think what's really important here is to remember that, even a single player can raise the bar in this space. And if you're a small business, this can be quite daunting today. If you look at how the world has transformed in automotives, and that industry, it's quite substantial with the plans that they have today. So I think the first step for all of the business owners, the CEOs there, is really to examine their own footprint, understand their climate risk exposure, and then define their business model around net zero. And I think when that has happened and the capability to do that is there, then actually the reporting piece will develop, I think, in parallel. I'm hopeful that it will develop in parallel, and that we'll see that become simpler and easier to do for SMEs. But I think that still in Asia, that understanding of where we are, we've got a little bit more work to do. We did a survey there recently of a number of big corporates and how many were building this into their thinking, building it into their plans going forward. And actually there was a very small percentage that had tangible plans around disclosure. So I think helping them to understand the importance of that is really key as well.
All right, thank you. Miranda, over to you.
Well, I'm not going to give three measures, but I think it's worth concentrating on the supply chain, because particularly in this region, it's a massive issue. And so yes, getting smaller companies and the supply chain to report would be massively helpful, and having transparency and disclosure around that. But obviously you're talking about companies that are being asked questions which they may not even necessarily consider in their businesses. You're adding a huge amount of sort of administrative burden, and potentially asking them to be audited, etc. And so I think a big question on this, and I mean, it's interesting, obviously, the work that the regulators can do in terms of implementing systems such as MAS is doing in Singapore, and so helping SMEs in the supply chain with reporting frameworks. But also there's a debate about who actually pays for that. So should it be the SME? Should it be the supply chain? And if you're thinking some of these supply chains, you're talking really like one-man band. Should that guy have to pay to, so that someone else can report their supply chain properly? Or should it be the people at the other end of the supply chain who should be funding some of these initiatives? And if you think of work that companies like Nestle have done in terms of putting professional practices and lots of sort of work into their supply chain to make sure, even if there's problems, that they can sort of overcome some of those. So it's interesting how much the end user and possibly the US or the EU companies should pay for the supply chain reporting, and how much is based in the SMEs. And I think it's particularly important now, you're thinking much more about scope 3 emissions. So people have to take responsibility for their purchased goods, which is their scope 3 emissions from all of the stuff that they purchase, whether it's foodstuffs or whether it's technology hardware. And if you can't trace that, then you're going to have problems with your own climate reporting. And so does Amazon start paying their suppliers in the ASEAN region in order to make sure it can actually hit its climate targets? So these are issues which are, we're just raising this as a debate now and don't have the answers, but I think it's a question about sort of whose responsibility, who pays, and how it can be made easier for a lot of the SMEs is a really big issue.
It's a very good point, actually, especially with the people at the European Commission coming up with ideas for sustainability reporting right through the supply chain. Formally, this may be a bit of an unfair question to you, but this is a key issue, and Michelin has extensive supply chains throughout the region, from rubber plantations right the way through to manufacturing and delivery. How are you going to approach ESG reporting throughout your supply chain, and what measures would you like to see to help you in that?
Well, I really think the most important thing here, Chris, is really to integrate ESG factors into the corporate strategy, like what we have done. We have announced our more sustainable approach for 2030. We cover people, profit, and planet. And for example, we just want to seek the best balance between people, profit, and planet. For people, we aim to be world-class in both employee engagement and safety, and become a reference in diversity and inclusiveness of the team. I'm not going into detail of all the indicator under each approach, but since you mentioned about planet, so we are targeting to reach carbon neutrality in 2050, not only from the point of view of our environmental footprint, but also in manufacturing, energy we use, and also the full circularity of our products. So we want to, number one, reduce sharply our CO2 emission in scope 1 and 2, and in the transportation related part of scope 3, with the goal of achieving carbon neutrality on this parameter by 2050. And lastly, increasing significantly the rate of sustainable material present in all our products, 40% by 2030, and in line with our target of 100% by 2050. So we have identified clear indicators of each ambition under profit, people, and the planet, to monitor the progress of all the domains.
Thanks. And Andrew, for the gold industry, what are some of the measures you think ASEAN as a region could adopt to help promote sustainability reporting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what I focused on in my discussion so far has been on large-scale mining, and that's important in some ASEAN economies, in particular Indonesia and to some extent the Philippines. But there's a lot of artisanal mining, and that's an informal area of the economy. It's important. Being realistic, you're not going to have family miners in some markets reporting ESG from places. That's not practical. But it's important that that sector of the gold market is, to the extent it can be, formalized and integrated. And a good case study really is the Philippines, where the central bank of the Philippines, it has, so this is pretty gold specific, but they have, their central bank refines gold at international standards so it can sell into international markets, but it buys from artisanal sources. And that's been a hugely important lever for improving standards in that sector. And reporting is important, but it's not the end. I mean, the idea is to improve standards, and you do that through pressure, and you do that through data disclosure. But there are elements of the economy that are informal, especially in emerging markets. And it's important that they're not excluded, and that tools are used to raise standards in that sector. Eventually, it will grow, and it will grow to an extent where international standards, including disclosure, would certainly apply. So I think there's work to be done on the formalization, I guess, of the informal aspects of the economy. I agree with what everybody said on what ASEAN can do more broadly, not just specifically on the gold market. There are a couple of things to add. I mean, ASEAN, it's there as a forum for discussion and for harmonization. I think that's really I think crucial in not just in this region, but to have really eventually a globally accepted standardized reporting requirements and definitions and so on. This year, uniquely, ASEAN has an opportunity to be a major driver of the discussion. Indonesia is hosting the G20, Thailand's hosting APEC this year. ASEAN always has a seat at the G20 meeting. So I think using those forums in a much more proactive way, I think would help as well.
Good point indeed. Okay, final quick question, I think, to all of you, and perhaps a yes or a no answer if you can to it. Do you think we will see in the next few years a truly harmonized ASEAN approach to ESG reporting, perhaps on the back of the ASEAN taxonomy? I will throw this one to Amanda first.
I think your question is in a few years. In a few years, if I'm saying that in a 3-year timescale, I'm going to unfortunately say no, because I think this field is evolving so much across the world, and we're so interlinked in ASEAN with other parts of the world that I think that would be very difficult to achieve. But I hope I'm wrong.
I hope you're wrong. Miranda?
I'm afraid I agree with Amanda. Yes, the debate about whether it should be local standards, international standards, what level of standards, and sort of all the different approaches, that's coming up significantly in debates around on the green taxonomies, but also in other elements such as some of the supply chain regulation and the social standards, and also the corporate governance. So yeah, I'm afraid it's going to take a while to bash those issues out, but I think the acceptance that there has to be some kind of common ground is there, and so I think coordination rather than maybe harmonization is the best we can hope for.
That's an important distinction. Bonmari, what's Michelin's view? You presumably like to see a more harmonized or better coordinated approach.
Well, I cannot agree more with Amanda and Miranda. Harmonization of ASEAN, standardization of regulations are not always easy, and in a few years' time, I really don't think we'll see the major development. And again, like Amanda, I hope I'm wrong. Even at the international level, I think there are room for improvement in standardizing the framework and the report. So but we can learn, ASEAN can learn from the more developed countries, or the countries that or the regions that are more well developed in sustainable report, and we can learn from them to help accelerate the process for ASEAN, Chris.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we lost Bayam to answer this question. She had to run to another meeting. Andrew, so the final word goes to you.
Final word is no. I agree. I think it's doesn't mean that we shouldn't be ambitious, but we're going to be realistic. And it isn't just ASEAN. The EU is having issues in this regard as well. I think go back to Miranda's point. I think the best we can hope for is coordination, because let's face it. The way ASEAN works, even if you do have an ASEAN-wide standard, it doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be adopted ASEAN-wide. So there are institutional shortcomings as well that will have an impact. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be ambitious.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. Thank you everybody who joined us today. ESG, extremely important. Mustn't forget the S and the G, even though the E may be more prominent at the moment, and reporting hopefully will become much more commonplace than it is already, and will probably certainly help the finance houses with their investment choices, and would hopefully make companies more attractive going forward and looking after the environment and their people and their own governance better. I've been Chris Humphrey. Thank you for joining us, and look out for further webinars coming up from the Business Council. Good night.
Thank you.